Welcome to our podcast series, Raising Saints and Forming Scholars, where we delve into your questions about the world of classical education. We were made for truth, beauty, and goodness. Let's talk about it. Here at Holy Child, we have art masterpieces on our walls to depict our St. Jerome's curriculum, which follows 9 historical eras. The art teacher, Mrs. Daugherty, and I often ask students to help us choose pieces of art on the wall. Today, we're going to be looking at 2 depictions of the tale of St. George and the Dragon. If you're listening to this podcast by using audio only, you should know we will be looking at these pictures in detail, so jump on over to YouTube so you can also take a look at the differences between Rafael and Rubens. Also, don't forget to vote and choose Rafael or Rubens on the comment section beneath this video, and you can see if you are voting just like a Holy Child student would. Thanks for listening. Well, hello, and welcome to our latest Raising Saints and Forming Scholars podcast. And today I have the most special guest. Everyone knows this is Mrs. D, our wonderful Matriarch of Arts, as we call you. And we're so excited here to talk to you about our latest section in our hallway in Mother Seton Hall. We are working on our next big order for narrating our St. Jerome curriculum. And one of the pieces that's going to be in our medieval section is a piece on St. George and the Dragon. And we are going to let the students vote, and they'll be choosing. Should we have a drum roll?
Yes.
Okay. They're going to be choosing between a Rubens and a Rafael. Now, one of my favorite things to talk about when we talk about all of the art in our hallway is the relationship that Mrs. D and I have in choosing the art. Mrs. D is our expert on everything, and she's embarrassed that I'm saying it, but it's okay, on what constitutes a masterpiece and what is something worthy of our students' attention in terms of art. My background's in history, and so I always like to situate the story in our beautiful curriculum that follows the pagans up into the medieval era, into the modern era. And so I just briefly actually want to talk about the pieces that we're looking at is the story of St. George and the Dragon. Now, St. George and the Dragon comes, I really love the Golden Legend. I don't know if you have a copy around. This is wonderful for Catholics. This is like the Saint Bible for Catholics. This is a 13th century work by Jacobis de Vorenya. And this was actually so popular that they say there were thousands of manuscripts of this, both in the original Latin and in Western European languages. It's been said in the late Middle Ages, no book was more widely read except for the Bible. And when we read about the lives of the different saints, I like it because the author, he doesn't care if it's a scientific fact or not. He's more concerned with the mystical meaning. So if you look at medieval stained glass, you'll see a lot of stories coming from the Golden Legend. So what is the story of St. George? In the Golden Legend, there's a dragon that's terrorizing a village and would only be appeased by the offering of a daily sheep for its feast. When no sheep could be found, lots were cast for a maiden to be sacrificed, and the lot fell to the monarch's daughter. Her father's money and power could not save her, so she went to the lake where the dragon lived, and she awaited her fate. But George came on his horse. He came in military garb. He came upon the scene, and after making the sign of the cross, he killed the dragon, and the princess was saved. All of the pagans in the town became Christians. And so with this tale, we are going to compare a Baroque piece and a Renaissance piece, or I probably said that wrong, a Renaissance piece and a Baroque piece for our children to choose. So Mrs. D, very quickly, maybe do we just want to situate ourselves? First, we're going to compare a Rafael, who was an Italian painter of the High Renaissance. He died in 1520, and I think this piece was painted in 1505.
Correct.
So this is our first piece. We'll be looking at a Raphael very quickly. We'll return to that. And then we're looking at a Rubens, which is later. He was born in 1577. This is a Flemish piece from the Baroque period, the Counter-Reformation. So we're looking at pieces that are separated by 100 years.
About 100 years.
Yes.
Correct.
So tell us about the Raphael piece.
Well, it is, very typical of a Renaissance piece.
Okay.
The Renaissance, of course, was the era when there was a rediscovery of the classical, the Greek aesthetic.
Okay.
And so the art of the Renaissance is very ordered. It has a great serenity to it. It's very poised and elegant and calm.
Calm. And how do you think Raphael manages to evoke this calm with someone on horseback?
Correct.
About to engage in a battle?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question. We should look at the configuration of the horse, the rider, and the dragon on the ground. They create a very stable, very restive triangle.
I see that.
And behind the triangle, you can see several right angles by virtue of the horizon lines and the very calm vertical trees.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yes, it is. Also, the emotional impact of the painting is very contained. We probably get more emotion from this winsome-looking horse looking back at us.
Okay, you're right.
But St. George looks very calm. Our damsel in distress over here she's not screaming.
No, she's
not. She's very poised. Even the dragon, he is snarling, but the emotion is just very contained. Wow. So, yeah. Now, another factor in Renaissance painting that kind of contributes to the overall calm is the lighting is very uniform.
I see.
There's not a big contrast in light and shadow. So, it's just a very calm, sunny day. We don't have a lot of atmospheric action going on
I never thought of it that way. So it would be the opposite of a chiaroscuro, let's say from a Caravaggio.
Correct. Exactly.
Interesting. And do you think Raphael included the calm and the serenity to remind us that God ultimately wins the battle, that God is sovereign, or was it just for pure aesthetics?
I think we're going to chalk it up to pure aesthetics. Okay. I think he demonstrates, or is trying to demonstrate, the victory of good over evil.
Okay.
By the white horse, which is, one of the horses from the four horses of the apocalypse from Scripture.
That would make sense.
And the white horse represents conquest. And, of course, St. George is positioned above the dragon, which, of course, represents evil,
yes,
or Satan. In the Renaissance, the painters, because of the use of uniform lighting, the edges of all the forms are very clear. You could take a pair of scissors and cut out the horse. You could cut out St. George. You could draw outlines around all of the forms in the painting. And we'll see when we get to the Baroque, that changes dramatically.
Interesting.
So Renaissance paintings have a clarity about them that is very appealing, but it's also, again, part of that classical aesthetic of clarity, of calm, not a lot of mystery in your Renaissance paintings.
I see. And I guess that would really make sense to just kind of like wrap up our look at the Renaissance. They were affirming the greatness of the human form coming from Greece and Rome, and just trying to emphasize the grandeur of man, right? And so it would make sense then that all those elements that you're pointing out like you said, it would make sense to see that in the Renaissance.
Very much so.
So now we're going to turn to the Counter-Reformation and the Baroque era with Rubens. We're moving outside of Italy. We're going north to the Flemish lands.
Correct. Maybe before we tackle the Rubens painting, it would be useful to look at a Caravaggio painting who really kind of ushered in the Baroque era. I wouldn't say single-handedly, but he was a major player in the shift between the Renaissance era and the Baroque.
Good to know.
And so we're going to look very briefly at his painting, The Calling of St. Matthew.
Okay.
And boy, the difference between the kind of the theatrical atmosphere of this painting versus the very contained and clear narrative quality of the Renaissance painting is very obvious. And Caravaggio is going to employ several things. The technique he's most famous for is chiaroscuro, which I believe you mentioned earlier, where you have an extreme contrast between light and dark. Chiaro is light, scuro is dark, clear, obscure, and there's a lot of obscurity in this painting. The edges are lost in shadow. There's no way you could define the edges, I don't think, of any of these figures. The lighting is extremely dramatic, and the lighting has a diagonal effect to it, and it directs the eye to who we believe was St. Matthew. This painting, by the way, is in the Contarelli Chapel in Rome, and there are 3 paintings of St. Matthew by Caravaggio in that chapel. So we believe that the figure pointing to his chest is St. Matthew.
So do you think, Mrs. D, is Caravaggio's use of light and shadow, it seems to be emphasizing more of the irrational elements in the human temperament as opposed to the very rational and serene pose that we got with Raphael?
It definitely is heightening the emotive response, of the figures in the painting. And what it is portraying is a moment in time of spiritual awakening.
I see.
And so we have on the right-hand side of the painting, we have Christ pointing to St. Matthew. And if you look carefully at his hand, it echoes the hand of Adam in the Sistine Chapel.
Wow. That
Michelangelo painted, of course, because the church teaches that Christ is the second Adam. Mm-hmm. And so he's pointing to St. Matthew, but he's not the focal point of the painting, which would probably not happen in a Renaissance painting. And St. Matthew, it's a little bit obscure if he's saying, me, you mean me? Mm-hmm. Or is he pointing to the young man at the end of the table who is counting the money? This is a group of tax collectors here. But the figures are very earthly. There's extreme naturalism as opposed to the ideal figures of the Renaissance. So moving from Caravaggio then to our painting of St. George and the Dragon by Rubens, who came a little bit later than Caravaggio, and as you said, he was in Northern Europe, in what was called Flanders. Here we have a very different treatment of St. George and the Dragon, where we have these very extreme diagonals. This white horse is almost cutting the painting in half at the corners. And St. George, his figure, is creating another extreme diagonal to the other corners of the painting. It's almost as if there's a big X dividing the painting up. And on the left side of the painting, which is lit up and bright, and which also contains a figure that represents the church, not necessarily a damsel in distress.
Right.
She's clinging to the lamb.
Yes.
Which sort of delineates her as a figure of the church. The left side of the painting is lit up and bright, but then the right side of the painting containing the serpent, and he is more serpentine than dragon-like in this painting, is very dark. And so it's a very kind of primitive treatment of light versus dark, good versus evil. And the horse is, again, a white horse representing conquest.
Right.
But he's quite different in nature from Raphael's horse.
Isn't he ever?
The Raphael horse could almost be a carousel horse. It's a horse you could think about riding.
Pet.
Correct.
Yeah.
But there's no way I would get on Rubens' horse.
Right.
The mane, the rippling muscles are very, very dramatic, full of action. One thing that's just stunning to me when you realize that both of these painters are painting from memory. No one posed. These horses did not pose.
That's a good point.
They were so thoroughly versed in anatomy, the anatomy of the figure, the anatomy of animals, that they could conjure up these images out of their heads. Their visual memories were phenomenal.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That is something to point out. When I was reading about these paintings, one thing that struck me, going back to what you were saying, the Rubens has this cosmic struggle between good and evil. And I was reading that it's almost like, the drama of the horse is like Christ coming down from heaven. Exactly. And defeating darkness. So you definitely get that sense. Now, do you think the cosmic struggle between good and evil, do you think it's more powerfully represented in the Rubens then over the Raphael, or is it just a matter of taste?
Well, if you're asking me which one I would vote for.
We know you vote for
I
Rubens,
would vote
right?
for the Rubens. Yes, because I think the story of, being locked in combat, that St. George and the church locked in combat with evil, it's much more dynamically represented by Rubens than it is by Raphael. The Raphael almost has a fairy tale quality to it. It's very charming. But I think if you want to portray that, dynamic struggle between good and evil, I think Rubens is your man. And, being the matriarch of art, maybe I get 3 votes.
Maybe you get 3 votes.
Yeah. So,
that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare the two images, the Rubens definitely looks more like a still from an action movie. The Raphael looks more like an illustration from a child's fairy tale book. Okay. So that's how they strike me.
Interesting.
But lots of people I love the Raphael. I had a reproduction of it hanging in my house for years because I saw it at the National Gallery. It's lovely. It's charming.
It is. Well, anything else to add about the Renaissance or the Baroque?
Let's see. Well, it's important to know that, the Council of Trent was in response to the Reformation, and it didn't dictate to artists how to represent religious images, but it was very interested in Catholic artists using art, painting and sculpture, and architecture to bring the faithful back to the Catholic faith. And so the painters took up the call, and the art became very dynamic, very theatrical, and there was a movement away from sort of that classical repose, containment of emotion. There's a lot more emotion in Baroque painting than in the Renaissance, and that was by virtue of that call that the painters
I
made
think
to the faithful.
It's important to, I think it's really important to bring that up. And I like historically that we started with the Golden Legend and we kind of ended with the Council of Trent, giving us sort of our Catholic bookends as we examine these two pieces of art. Well, our students are going to vote, Mrs. D, and we're going to find out if our school is more inclined towards the Renaissance or towards the Baroque. But we would love your feedback. We would love it if you would vote, add your favorite on the comments section on this podcast, and you can see if you voted just like a Holy Child Catholic student. Thank you, Mrs. D, for enlightening us about these two pieces of art.
Thank you, Ms. Martinez.
We'll see you next time on Raising Saints and Forming Scholars. We like to highlight our very own students here at Holy Child Catholic School. Let's take a look at what one of our students said from a previous video about the role of art in her own life and in her own imagination.
This painting, The Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, pictures a man standing before the unknown. It inspires in me a sense of mystery and of adventure, and it reminds me that the purpose of our lives as human beings is to find God. At Holy Child, we've been taught how to view beauty. What is beautiful is different than something that is pretty. Beauty should pierce our hearts and remind us of our true calling to be with God. This man seems to stand without fear and is willing to be filled with awe and wonder at the scene before him. This is how we should approach our lives, trusting that God's plan for our future is filled with hope.